Welcome back, everybody, and an extra special integral stage welcome to anybody who is not part of everybody, because we're trying to be inclusive. I'm Layman Pascal out front, so you don't have to be. Today, we're joined by one of my favorite people, Mr. Jared Morningstar, to take a deep dive into something like Islam for a time between worlds, or maybe Metamodern Mohammedanism. But honestly, that sounds somewhat strange to say. A lot of people are skeptical of Islam today, and that can put a freeze on more interesting discourse. Partly, I assume that Islamo-skepticism is a kind of residual quasi-racist historical antagonism between the ancient tensions of the Greeks and the Persians, the Christians and the Caliphate, etc. Some of it's obviously based on recent events like the rise over several decades of murderous, politically oriented Islamic sects in countries where modernization has destabilized them. The topic of Islam also brings up for all secular people their various suspicions about monotheisms and book cults in general. So there's some anxiety for people to go through on this topic and some nuances to clarify, but it's also a tremendous opportunity to re-experience Islam through metamodern eyes and to probe the spiritual and community strategies of the Sufis and to feel into whatever healthy possibilities of depth-oriented, wisdom-oriented, humanly sane developmental Islamic futurism might exist. So here to be our dandy psychopomp and thoughtful guide is Metamodernism's go-to guy on the confluence of psychedelics, process philosophy, Scandinavian culture, and Islam, the star of JaredMorningstar.com and founder of the Alif Review. It's Jared Morningstar. Hi, Jared.
Hello. Thanks for having me here. Excited to get into it.
Did that stuff all sound reasonable, or was any of it too crazy?
I don't know if it was reasonable, but it sounds great and exciting and exactly like what I'm about. So great place to start.
Awesome. Let's be unreasonable if we need to be. I guess the first thing is that when modern or postmodern folks see any bunch of people doing a prayer routine, we can get triggered. The concern is that conformism or robotic motions and indoctrination and brainwashing possibilities might be socially imposed on people, on children, on families, and inhibit the natural growth of personal sovereignty and free thought. But at the same time, we can't help but admire the devotional regularity, the shared spirit, and from my point of view, exercises that simultaneously activate heart, mind, and body. So I guess I'm curious how you personally hold this tension between spiritual enactment and the risk of exaggerated ethnocentric conformity.
Yeah, good question, and certainly one that is alive within Islamic spaces, both for converts like myself and for people born into the Islamic faith. Personally, as I've sort of deepened into this ritual prayer practice of doing this sort of devotional routine 5 times a day, I haven't found it to be overly stringent, but I absolutely see how that's the sort of tenor of this practice from the outside. One metaphor that I've heard sort of Islamic speakers use to talk about this form of spirituality that is admittedly rather rote and involves a certain amount of rigor in terms of form and the specificity of timing and things like this, is to compare it to music, where if you're a musician and you're trying to learn to actually be really good at music, be able to really make beauty come alive through an instrument, you got to devote yourself to the particularities of this instrument and the kind of music you're really trying to play. So you're going to have to be practicing your scales, and no, you cannot decide that there's now an E flat in C major. It actually does matter that there's an E, because this is one of the sort of major ways to express one of the sort of forms that music comes in. So you do need to be attentive to the traditions and how these things are structured in a deep way. And I think it's pretty analogous with the prayer practice. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things you need to sort of go through to prepare, with the ablution, the sort of ritual purification with water prior to even doing the prayer practice itself. And then, yes, there's very particular ways you need to stand and bow and prostrate and all these things. And there's particular Arabic phrases that you'll be using throughout. But within that structure, there is a lot of flexibility, just like no one would say that a musician playing a piece in C major is being sort of under the tyranny of this piece. The structure of that scale opens up these certain possibilities of affect that could not be opened to otherwise without the use of that framing device. So having some structure is helpful, but then within that, there's a lot of possibility for how do I want to sort of feel into this? What kind of sort of incantation do I want to use at this part of the prayer? Because there's some openness to it there too. There's some improv. You incorporate sort of petitionary prayer within the practice as well, though it is primarily what I would call more liturgical prayer, using these kind of set sacred phrases drawing from the Quran and the tradition. So it's once you're in it, it's a nice meld, and it doesn't really have that same feeling of sort of oppressive rigor, but it does have regularity, structure, which if you're able to submit to that in the way that feels healthy, where you can kind of see what kind of work this is potentially doing on you. It's a very there's a lot of ease in the practice. It feels very, very tranquil and uplifting in a pretty immediate way.
You find yourself getting better at playing this particular music?
Yeah, I think so. I'm certainly getting more regular, which is one of the most important aspects of this practice, is just the consistency and regularity of it. I do wish I would be able to bring in a degree of mindfulness that I haven't always achieved, though sometimes. But that's probably a primary goal for me right now, is to get some of those mental states, bringing that with the same kind of rigor and intensity that sort of the physical and vocal elements are bringing as well. So perhaps some Zazen training outside of my prayer practice could be helpful there. But I'm not too like grief stricken for not being perfectly prayerful. It's certainly an aspirational practice, and I think the important sort of tenor is the kind of intentionality that you bring to it. So even if you're not hitting all the mental states, I think there's something still happening for you. With that sort of strong intention to do something religiously, ritualistically meaningful, to put yourself symbolically before the ultimate, the one, the all merciful, the all compassionate, and to sit with that, even if you're doing that kind of imperfectly in the moment.
There's a premise in things like integral theory and spiral dynamics and the stages model that you could basically take any richly evolved cultural operating system, in this case Islam, and run it up the developmental escalator. Like, you could have the same forms and words and style stratified to operate in different but complementary ways at different levels of emergent sociocognitive complexity. That would mean having like a tribal Islam and an ethnocentric Islam and a modernist Islam and a pluralist Islam and integrative, somehow available and working together as a team. Does that sound plausible? Could that actually be done, or is it just a developmentalist fantasy?
I think there's definitely potential there. There's also certainly a number of hurdles to that. I think there, within the Islamic context specifically, there would need to be a high degree of fidelity to the traditional forms. So when you get to your modernist Islam and your pluralist Islam, if people start sort of interpreting away the prayer obligation, for example, and saying, oh, it's sort of only this practice that has these positive impacts in the domains of human life that are sort of ethically and interpersonally conducive to like healthy communities and such. You're going to get a lot of pushback then from the sort of other stages that take these to have more metaphysical significance. And so if your modernists are kind of trying to, from the outside, using sort of a non-Islamic groundwork or framework to kind of interpret away what is perceived as sort of traditional obligations, the traditional kind of guardrails, that's going to cause a lot of conflict, and that's something that has very much happened in the Islamic world. So in the 18th, 19th centuries, 20th centuries, you get Islamic modernism coming into the fold, and this is something happening in the backdrop of colonialism and that experience for the Muslim world. And so you have these sort of new kind of intellectuals coming to the fore who are not sort of traditionally trained at Islamic seminaries in sort of the religious sciences and sort of the corpus of important religious texts and such. And usually these people have some European education or some other form of kind of modernized education, and they come and they kind of try and reinterpret the tradition in light of modernity and such. And what ended up happening with this, among other things, is that you had a lot of sort of repetition of a very European Western style thinking that now in the 21st century, looking back, seems very strange to us. And so there are these pitfalls that can happen here when one is sort of too wooed by some intellectual tradition that is outside of what one sort of indigenous society is dealing with. And you can import a lot of baggage if you're not very careful, and you can get rid of a lot of babies in the bathwater as well. So there was some good, certainly from the Islamic modernists. They raised some important questions. They founded some interesting institutions, but they also threw out quite significant portions of the tradition. Oftentimes, they were quite antagonistic against Sufism. Actually, they thought it was a very sort of almost Gnostic, kind of too psychologically focused and esoteric and disconnected from worldly lived matters. And so they thought that this focusing on a spiritual element was what kind of got the Islamic world partially off track from the more kind of scientifically focused Europeans who were able to develop and do all this science and technology stuff in the modern period. And so, yeah, it created fault lines, certainly, some unfortunate ones that persist to this day. And nowadays, certainly, especially in the West, you have Muslims of various flavors that would be in sort of this green postmodern stage, and very much connected with the Western academy often, and some other cultural spheres as well. But these are certainly people who are very interested in sort of Islamic responses to racism and colonialism, these sorts of things. And such people can also feel to the more traditional Muslims as, oh, these are modernized Westerners trying to distort Islam. They care more about this sort of pro-gay, anti-racist agenda than they do about their sort of traditional obligations for prayer and the like. So yeah, lots of different fault lines that have actually developed as a result. But I think there is a potential that things could be more cohesive across these different phases with sort of a a high fidelity. So whereas the Islamic modernists made some missteps in my eyes by not being sort of sufficiently embedded in the tradition before then trying to go about this project of importing some Western European modern intellectual material. With that case, it makes it easy to say, oh, well, you don't even know your hadith collections, you haven't read this commentary, and you're trying to tell us how to do our legal system now without having any training here. And it's like, that's questionable, even if that legal tradition has some serious issues with it that from a modern or postmodern perspective lead to some undesirable social systems and outcomes and the like.
It's an interesting complaint that the modernist is insufficiently rooted in the tradition. Because on the one hand, you'd say, all right, well, if we want to have modernity, it needs to be somewhat indigenously produced in our culture, and it needs to be very much rooted in an understanding of these things. But you could also say that that's a sort of cynical ploy to reject modernity and postmodernity in general. Does it seem to you that when people make that critique that they're coming from a genuine place, or does it seem like it's more like they're protecting a zone they don't want to have disturbed?
I think it's both, frankly. I think the people who are really reactive around modernity in the Islamic world, there's something very authentic about their response and what they're feeling, but at the same time, it is very reactive. It is very kind of low caliber sort of intellectual stuff. Like, you're dealing with these very big categories of Islam and modernity, and are these even comparable things? Like, modernity is ostensibly some stage of human development begun in the West. It has sort of intellectual and cultural components, and Islam is this religion and civilization that began in Arabia in the 600s. It's like there's certainly ways that these things interact, undeniably, but to try and compare them without doing some serious work on how that would be framed is a very fraught intellectual task. So certainly a lot online nowadays, you'll see very sort of outright dismissive sort of Muslim responses, like anything that has a twinge of sort of secularism or liberalism is sort of written off forthright, that, oh, this is Western modernity, they're trying to impose it on us, this is not Islamic, and it's not a healthy response, because it's not dealing with these things at the level of granularity that they really require, because of course what actually is happening, even though this is the rhetoric, is these Islamic societies, even the much more fundamentalist ones, are gung-ho about science and technology, oftentimes very much embedded in global capitalism. These are not the things that get the critique. It is certain cultural issues, especially, that come to the fore, and these sort of moods of modernity and post-modernity that can be kind of naturalizing of religion, and seek to move forward to a certain kind of social egalitarian set of social structures that they're not exactly equivalent to some Islamic social organizations. Not that the Islamic social organizations are necessarily completely backwards and illiberal and all these sorts of things that you would see from kind of the cultural right in America or something, that wants to really pit Islam and the West against one another. There's a lot within the Islamic tradition that is quite progressive, especially if we go back to the original socio-historical context of the initial revelation. We're looking at very significant improvements in women's rights and sort of station in society. built on a much more kind of essentialist ideal of gender than what we're dealing with nowadays. And so trying to get those things to work together can be difficult, and much within the sort of traditional side of the Islamic world today, whether it's the more kind of fundamentalist types or the sort of genuinely traditionalists who have this kind of deep continuity and this sort of magisterial intellectual tradition, they're going to want to kind of hold on to some of these forms of the sort of way that Islamic societies have been organized. And so this leads to things like attachment to the idea that a woman is going to get less inheritance than a man from a deceased father, probably, or that a woman's testimony is not equivalent to a man's in court. But if you look at some of these things compared to the pre-Islamic Arab customs, these are huge steps forward. These are sort of massive improvements that, women kind of didn't have any of these rights at all before then, in a lot of ways. So a lot of the kind of contemporary progressive Islamic sentiment is like, let's look at the sort of spirit of the revelation and try to reproduce that in contemporary context rather than merely reproducing sort of the specific exact forms that the tradition took to embody this spirit in its own age, which was an age of empires, certainly. So lots of complexities there, and again, some fault lines. But it's interesting that the sort of anti-modern, anti-Western traditionalists, whether they be more fundamentalist or sort of authentically traditionalist, they do sort of absorb things from modernity that they don't really talk about, these kind of capitalist technology kind of stuff. Not much critical thought going in there, but these other issues, they must be dealt with so stringently. So that's something I find I have a lot of sort of critical perspective on.
Tradition in general sort of draws us toward the past, right? Toward the idea, A, of inheritance, and B, of the idea that most of what we need to know might already have been established for us. And that's, like you're saying, that's in tension with some of the modern and postmodern social developments that are going on in the world lately. But what if we push forward? I mean, I think of a phrase like Islamic futurism or integral caliphate, and do these have any meaning at all? Is there a sense of the future in Islamic discourse, of what it could be? Where's the science fiction in Islam?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is some. There's a really good Islamic science fiction novel I read in college called Alif, the Unseen. Highly recommended if you're looking for some cyberpunk Islamicate literature. And so it's out there. It's not sort of widely embraced, but certainly I think some of the ways that the Islamic orthodoxy has developed is sort of exceptionally sort of oriented towards the past. And part of that has to do with these major ideas of sort of, Muhammad is this final prophet and the Quran is this sort of final revelation, this perfect encapsulation of God's sort of communication with humanity. So there's some of that pretty built into some of the kind of core Islamic beliefs, but a lot of that sort of developed in a much stronger articulation as the tradition developed. And so in Sunni Islam, you have a pretty strong idea that sort of the immediate companions of Prophet Muhammad and the sort of immediately following generations are kind of the ideal model, the ideal community. And so this group of early Muslims is called the Salaf, which means like the companions or something along those lines. It's a decent way to think about it anyways. And so nowadays, the much more kind of literalist, puritanical interpretation of Islam is the Salafi interpretation. So these are the people trying to go back to the companions, the Salaf, and sort of reconstitute their sort of pure form of Islam for our contemporary times. And again, they're doing this all while Saudi Arabia is this sort of massive oil hub and like very embroiled in contemporary capitalism and such. And so that's the Salaf, they don't care about that so much, but God forbid that there's some gay guy or women are driving cars without a male companion or something like that. And so, yeah, I think there is generally kind of a somewhat pathological fixation on the past. Though I think some of that sort of traditional longing to be deeply connected to the past, to have this touchstone of primordial wisdom that the tradition has sort of shepherded forward. I think that's a real gem that the Islamic world has perhaps sort of maintained to a greater cohesion than much of the Christian West, with some exceptions. So I think it's not only bad there. I think there's some genuine good to have all these sorts of historical sources of wisdom that have been preserved to a large degree with pretty good fidelity. But yeah, I was in a Facebook comment discussion on a post I made about some of these issues broadly once, and I was like, yeah, I'd really like to see some more sort of forward thinking in sort of contemporary Islamic intellectual discourse. And I got a response from an acquaintance, and he said something along the lines of, "Oh, forward thinking, that's a colonialist notion based on theories of progress that are totally unsuitable to sort of Islamic thought." And it's like, I like see where the connection is. It's not entirely without basis. These sorts of theories of progress have been very much weaponized against particularly colonized peoples to disrupt their traditions and historical ways of life. And we certainly want to sort of push back on that. But to say that any kind of sort of progressive intellectual venture is de facto colonial and embroiled in these sort of terrible social structures is a stretch for me. And it's also very funny that this deeply traditionalist Muslim is using post-colonial theory to defend his traditionalism. So you can see how these things really kind of form this complex tapestry of different dispositions in much more complicated ways than sort of just a linear map. But yeah, I think there's good work being done. I think if you go back to the Islamic philosophers and sort of find some sort of groundwork, framework in those works, there's a lot that can be sort of used to scaffold more creative, dynamic, forward, future-oriented Islamic thought. But in sort of the contemporary dynamics, it's going to be hard to do that well unless it is coming from someone who is also sort of deeply embedded in this past-looking perspective of the tradition. If you're going to try and do this without deep familiarity of the Quran, the Hadith tradition, the schools of jurisprudence in the tradition, sort of Orthodox theology, if you don't have sort of a robust traditional credential, you're going to get dismissed pretty offhandedly. And even if you do have those credentials and you are not sort of careful about how you frame these things, likewise, there's going to be significant sort of cultural pushback.
It seems analogous to the situation in the United States in many ways, that there's a kind of collusion between fundamentalist Puritans, modern economic structures, and a certain version of the postmodern critique, all of which inhibits the ability to really envision futures that are more humanly and ecologically and spiritually satisfying for us. But I think you mentioned Sufism, and as a esoterically oriented transmodernist in my youth, I was very attracted to vague notions of the Sufis. And I wonder if you could give us your sense of like what distinguishes them. What is a Sufi? What's the definition of a Sufi? How are they different than general Islamites?
Yeah, so I end up talking about this question a lot, as it's not something that has a ton of sort of cultural awareness in the West, outside of certain niche circles where I am. But my sort of main point is actually that Sufism is not deeply dissimilar from Orthodox Islam, especially historically. Nowadays, with the rise of this Salafi perspective and the sort of Islamic modernists, there has been a significant effort to distance sort of mainstream Orthodox Islam from Sufi traditions. Historically, that's much less the case. Not that there weren't certain conflicts or divisions between, say, the Sufis and the jurists, but it's significantly sort of overstated and become much more stringent, somewhat ironically, sort of off the back of a lot of Orientalist studies that tried to locate Sufism as some kind of foreign Christian influence on Islam, because Islam is this stringent legalistic religion that doesn't have much of an affective component. It's rote, it's legalistic. But here's Sufism that's deeply sort of devotional and philosophical and metaphysical, and so gave the Orientalists quite the puzzle. But throughout Islamic history, Sufism has been a sort of major aspect of the tradition. And going back to the Prophet himself and some of the sacred sort of material here. So there's this famous hadith of Gabriel, so Gabriel the angel, and a hadith is sort of a story or a report or a saying attributed to the Prophet, or sort of some kind of vignette of a portion of his life. And so in this hadith, you have the angel Gabriel sort of appearing in the form of a man to the Prophet and his immediate companions. And he comes up to the Prophet and he asks him, what is Islam? And he gives an answer, sort of outlining the 5 pillars of the religion that most people will probably be familiar with. And after that, Gabriel says, you've answered correctly. And sort of all the companions are very taken aback that there's some stranger suddenly quizzing their sort of highest authority about the message that he himself has brought. But following that, Gabriel questions the Prophet about Iman, which is often translated as faith. And so he gives a basic statement about sort of believing in God and the last day and his prophets and angels, sort of big picture creedal, sort of mythic metaphysical perspectives. And then finally, Gabriel asks about ihsan, which is a harder Arabic word to translate. It's often translated as sort of beauty or sort of perfection of character. But here Muhammad gives an answer somewhat along the lines of to live as if you see God, because he certainly sees you. And so this is kind of the stack of Islamic religious sentiment, and this third sort of pinnacle aspect, ihsan, is kind of the basis of then the Sufi traditions that develop and trace their sort of lineages directly back to Prophet Muhammad for their spiritual authority. So you get these crazy diagrams that show exactly who taught who up to the present master of the order and such. But it's a very spiritually oriented tradition. It is philosophically sort of deeply engaged, and sort of with some Neoplatonist roots in that intellectual tradition there, which the Muslims sort of thankfully shepherded up till the sort of medieval West. So it was through the sort of Muslim philosophers that people like Thomas Aquinas then were able to rediscover Aristotle and sort of revive or develop Christian theological perspectives in the West then. And not only through Aristotle, I mean, he was deeply influenced by the Islamic philosophers themselves as well. So they weren't sort of mere sort of emissaries of this Hellenic intellectual material, but had genuine contributions themselves, of course. But yeah, Sufism is deeply devotional. Many Sufis themselves were jurists within the Islamic world, and rather than thinking of Sufism as sort of a particular sect of Sunni Islam, it's better to think of it as a certain dimension or collection of institutions, which themselves are sort of orthodox within the religion. So you certainly wouldn't think of the jurists or the theologians as some kind of separate sect, even as certain people may be sort of more or less focused on those elements of the religion. But Sufism was very sort of influential in popular piety throughout the Islamic world, and it still is, even as nowadays there's a lot more kind of pushback against that from various corners. But yeah, it's a vibrant spiritual tradition that continues to this day. I am sort of loosely involved with the Naqshbandi Sufi order, which is a very, very prominent, very important global order that has all sorts of interesting roots and beautiful, beautiful community. And it's Muslim, it's Islamic in a very deep sense. So
I have the impression that there's a tension or an ambiguity around the role of the occult in Islam, right? That there's a sense of suppression and antagonism, but also a sense in which many of the features of European Hermeticism draw from Islamic sources, and there's been some absorption of pagan magical practices into Islam to some extent. I'm curious about that because one of the things that's characterized the move in the West from both strict monotheism and strict modernism has been a kind of relaxation around the experimental use of occult practices. Do you think there's, what is the general Islamic take? And is there room going forward for a kind of Islamic relaxation around experimentation with these sorts of practices?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Historically, this is certainly something that happened within Sufism and to a high degree within Shiism. So I've mostly been talking about sort of the Sunni, which is the majority interpretation of the religion. But there's also the Shi'i minority that has a slightly different flavor. Most of what I say holds, but in Shiism, there isn't kind of this separation of Sufism as its own kind of institution, and you have this much more kind of hierarchical religious spiritual structure that kind of integrates theological, philosophical, spiritual, and legal authority in the person of the imam. And so, yeah, this is certainly an aspect of Islamic spirituality that has existed historically, and Sufi philosophers and mystics were kind of heavy into the science of letters or the science of numbers, sort of looking at the sort of mystical, esoteric meanings of these different letters and numbers, and using that to kind of create these divination and talismanic sort of systems that this is kind of on the outskirts of the orthodoxy at this point, but within Sufi circles, this is certainly no crazy proposition. And you have these masters of these orders who are developing certain kinds of spiritual technologies, spiritual practices for their communities, suited to the particular age and the location and temperament of the communities. But occultism is going to be a hard sell if it's presented as occultism to sort of the larger Islamic audience today. There's especially within the Salafi corners, there's a very strong aversion to this idea of innovation, bid'ah in Arabic. So this is sort of the introduction of novel religious practices, or almost any kind of practices at a certain point, into an Islamic framework. So these folks are very attached to the idea that sort of everything that is necessary has been sort of given and presented in Muhammad's life, and then sort of the immediately following companions. And so if you can't find it there, you're kind of out of luck, and actually you're doing something deeply sinful. You're sort of committing an act of disbelief or polytheism by trying to sort of develop anything that has a hint of novelty in terms of religious practices. So even something as deeply traditional as the Sufi dhikr practice, which is this remembrance of God, sort of the incantation of these litanies of sort of sacred phrases and God's names, which can be found in the Quran and the tradition itself. Even that is often written off as bid'ah by these folks. So it's going to be really difficult to really make any headway in introducing any kind of new practice. But within the right sort of esoteric circles, which exist still in certain corners of Shiism and Sufism, I think there's definitely potential to, take advantage of the practices that already exist there, and sort of are enshrined by sort of the authority of the particular Sufi order, and think about ways that you could sort of be creative in terms of using this spiritual material in dynamic ways as a inspiration for more novel practices. But there's a lot of material there, certainly.
When I talk with people who are engaged in work that purports to involve the transmission of consciousness or useful subtle energies, I often ask whether they think words like surrender and submission are necessary to elicit the participatory mode they're trying to evoke or not. Because obviously there's a need to enter into a kind of sacred gesture that facilitates a resonant transformational encounter. But perhaps we could call it something else that isn't so loaded with political implications about relative social status among human beings. So I'm curious about your take. Is submission a necessary or a problematic phrasing about how we relate to the divine and to the representatives of the divine?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very case-by-case basis, depending on a person's individual temperament. I think at the end of the day, whether we use this word or not, what it signifies is likely a necessary spiritual virtue to cultivate for at least getting into certain of these kind of ethical developmental experiences and sort of unveilings of spiritual knowledge that can come in mystical traditions. I personally am quite attached to that phrasing. Not that it will work for everyone, depending on their personal experiences, but yeah, perhaps as a foil to a certain trend of deep individualism in the West, I think it can be sort of a helpful pushback. But certainly this is something which is better sort of experienced in the context of a genuine community and some teacherly authority with the Sufi master or whoever that actually can help facilitate how to really embody submission in the proper way, because you don't want to be submitting to the wrong stuff. And in fact, that is sort of exactly the critique of these sort of Salafi traditionalists. They are deeply concerned about sort of issues of idolatry and maybe you shouldn't be submitting to this worldly political authority or this sort of spiritual teacher of sketchy lineage. So I think there's actually something there to the critique they have. I don't think they're without merit. But I think keeping things in a container, a community that has a real connection to some spiritual knowledge and tradition can help make sure that submission is sort of properly understood and undertaken. But a term I like, certainly. I think it gives a nice it's evocative, it's like, ooh, submission. So in Islam, the word itself is often translated as submission, but the way the Arabic language works, words are constructed by these sort of trilateral roots. So Islam is made up of SLM, basically, which is also the same root that makes up the word salam, which means peace. So it gives these words these sorts of kind of clouds of meaning around them that have these implicit semantic connections. So the submission that is sort of hinted at with Islam is one that has this tone of sort of peacefulness, of tranquility, of sort of being well sort of situated, fitting into the sort of natural fabric of the flow of creation. So it's got a very sort of Taoist sort of sentiment to it, almost, of that sort of submission, that kind of the flow of the Tao and such, which is very different than the kind of giving up of authority in this sort of human social relationship that can feel very like degrading and like power dynamics, all these sorts of things. But I don't know, it's got this like BDSM connotation too, and maybe we should lean into that.
There's something in all of this that often goes uninspected, I think, which is the difference in the style of how people do any of these things. Like peace, is it the peace of being kind of chilled out, or is it the peace of having subjugated everything that might agitate you? Right? You were mentioning these sort of Salafi fundamental critiques, be careful who you submit to, and be on guard for the sort of regressive polytheism that doesn't understand the unitive glory of the world. But there's a big difference between suggesting that to someone and trying to enforce that on everyone. So there's I almost want to say, does Islam need a 60s? Something like that, right? That's body work, that's psychedelics, that's the resurgent feminine, that's a new appreciation of sexuality, including BDSM or any of the areas we might go into. And that's a huge tangle of topics. So maybe I would pick it apart one by one. What's the role of psychedelics in Islamic culture, and what could it be going forward?
Yeah, this is something I've thought a little bit about and written on just very briefly, but there's a lot more to say and explore in depth, and that's certainly some work I'd be interested in continuing. Granted, I have the time and energy that this task requires. Typically, and I don't think this will be particularly surprising to our listeners, Islam is sort of anti-intoxicant. So the alcohol prohibition is obviously the sort of most known of this variety of sort of religious rule, and that's kind of what it comes back to in these sort of sacred sources. And so there's kind of reasoning by analogy that alcohol intoxicates and was pretty kind of explicitly forbidden in these texts. So by analogy, other substances that may have a similar effect are likewise frowned upon. Of course, doesn't necessarily mean that's actually how things played out historically in all places. And there's some Sufi groups that are a bit more lenient or creative around these sorts of things. There's the Bektashi Sufi order, which has like a big presence, I think, in the Balkans region. And I think I once heard through the grapevine that there's a saying from Bektashi Muslims that, if Allah had only known about plum wine, he wouldn't have said all that stuff. So that's pretty far from the Islamic orthodoxy at that point. Where I sort of enter into this question is kind of two angles. One is looking at this idea of intoxication a bit more critically. I think it's pretty clear to people that if you consume a certain amount of alcohol, your consciousness, reasoning capacities for judgment slip away. Even your sort of basic awareness it kind of loosens, and you get closer to a sort of unconsciousness. So I think that's a pretty good sort of prototypical understanding of intoxication, this sort of consciousness dulling kind of effect. And I think you see some of that in marijuana, not to the same degree as with alcohol, but I think case by case and depending on the intentionality of the person using it and the dosage, there's an intoxication to marijuana as well. I think when you come to psychedelics, that frame becomes a lot more questionable with the substances in question. Certainly, there are significant perceptual alterations caused by psychedelics. Your affect can shift a lot. Your experience of time can change. You probably don't want to be sort of operating a motor vehicle, but you're very deeply present in a way that is definitely not the case with typical sort of alcohol usage. You are entering into some spiritual perceptions and some heightened perceptions of sort of the empirical world around you. I'm not sure intoxication is the right frame there. So kind of questioning that premise for why these substances would be considered haram or sort of impermissible, and then sort of using this framework from Islamic law, the Sharia or jurisprudence, fiqh. So there's this idea of the maqasid al-Sharia, the sort of aims or intentions of the law. And I might not be able to outline this perfectly right now, but basically it's this kind of higher order idea that, the divine law that God gave us actually has some like meaning and purpose to it that is kind of identifiable in certain ways. So I think there's like 5 categories that are typically outlined, but you have things like sort of the preservation of life and religion and sort of social order, family, these sorts of things. So using this sort of lens rather than trying to kind of comb through all the hadith and Quranic material and sort of reason by analogy and refer to sort of past opinions by jurists. I think using this schema, psychedelics aren't sort of negatively impacting your health and thus sort of your life. One of the other categories here is sort of intellect or reasoning. I don't think so. This would be why sort of alcohol would be kind of questionable from this framework. It's really impacting your ability to reason and think clearly. Psychedelics, I think, again, it's.
You think you might be able to make a Islamic legalistic argument that, say, psilocybin doesn't count as an intoxicant and should be tolerated in Islamic culture?
Yeah, and that's going to be a hard sell, but. There's actually a decent bit of openness around sort of the sort of novel medical uses of these substances. So whereas the Islamic tradition sort of strongly says no to recreational substance use, they give a green light for medical uses, typically. So I've seen Muslims say, yeah, psilocybin therapy, MDMA therapy in this medical context, it's going to be okay by an Islamic standard. It's this medical use, validated, effective, few side effects, and it's used just in this context. Where I think that perspective alone is kind of insufficient is that you're going to have people taking these substances recreationally regardless. And some of these people are going to have deep spiritual experiences while under the influence of these psychedelics. And if they then come to their tradition, their wisdom tradition, their spiritual teachers, and this is where they're going to find the resources for like understanding and integrating these experiences. And instead, the sort of response is, "Oh, that's forbidden. What you saw was just hallucinations. It's demonic. It was the work of jinn." It's gonna create a lot of cognitive dissonance, and I think that's probably unhelpful in the long term. So. I don't think psychedelic use is probably ever going to get the sort of green light of go ahead, use psychedelics as a Muslim. I think that my own sort of inclination is it should at least get to this legal category of sort of neutral, or even if it's in this sort of interesting category of like disliked. I think that'd be helpful. Rather than this sort of forbidden category, where we're kind of weighing that this can have some real impacts, but we might not want to throw open the floodgates either. So I think if we can get to a point where Sufi communities can act as helpful spaces of integration for these experiences, even if they're not sort of fully sanctioned, I think that would be a step in the right direction.
So the next query under the heading of does Islam need a 60s is something around the body, right? So we have in the West, there's been the development of a kind of cultural self-critique that involves new somatic awareness, bodywork therapies, the idea that religious or secular, we've had a pattern of storing trauma in our bodies, of being more mechanical, less flexible, less organic, storing up emotional tension and exploding. And this also fits in with a kind of Western stereotype about Islamic culture as having these sorts of bodies. So I'm curious, what is the awareness of the need for body work, for massage, for physiological therapy and things like that, especially given that the normal armoring that civilizations place on the bodies and hearts of their citizens is adumbrated by the fact that all kinds of traumas have been inflicted upon a lot of these countries, right? You can't bomb people for generations and not have them deeply storing trauma in their bodies. So, what is even the Islamic awareness of the possibility of body work?
Yeah, really, really interesting. I will say, and might be kind of provocative and surprising. I think that the Islamic civilization, Islamic religion, generally has a less sort of pathological, guilt-ridden approach to sex, sexuality, the body than the Christian world. So we don't have this idea of original sin. And while sexuality and sex is pretty strongly confined to this institution of marriage, within that institution, you have a much more kind of positive, open idea about sexual activity. Doesn't need to be purely procreative. It can be a sort of intimate bonding experience between the husband and wife. And you got Islamic jurist texts that talk about how it's really good to do cunnilingus, and that there should be some serious reciprocity here between male and female, and considering the pleasure of the woman as an important sort of aspect to this relationship. So already there you have something that, in my estimation, is a healthier sort of groundwork to sort of approach questions of sex and sexuality, even as some of the kind of stricture around it may seem a bit intense by contemporary non-Muslim standards. In terms of body work more generally, it's not a topic I've seen significantly discussed in Islamic spaces, but I don't see a reason why this would necessarily fall outside of the pale of things people would entertain. I mean, certainly the prayer practice is deeply embodied and has some sort of benefits in that respect of going through these motions regularly. And there's certain Sufi practices that are deeply embodied. Perhaps the most iconic of these is the Hadra, this kind of it almost looks like a rave that's going on. These people going in a circle and chanting and dancing. This is the kind of stuff that the Salafis really don't like, and throw around this accusation of innovation. But in terms of somatic therapies, I see no reason why Muslims wouldn't be open to the healing possibility of these. And the body is not this sinful sort of degenerate aspect of our created being. So to work with it, to develop a healthy, positive relationship with it, we got the green light in that regard.
Right. Let's see. If an interested, smart, spiritually inclined human was going to read one Islamic scholar or mystic, who would you recommend?
Good question. In terms of a mystic, probably my favorite text is, and this is going to be something a bit more approachable or accessible than kind of esoteric kind of philosophy, theology kind of stuff. But the Sufi poet Farid Attar, Persian guy, sort of classical period, Iranian in modern standards. He has this lovely sort of epic poem, The Conference of the Birds. And that's just sort of packed full of spiritual sustenance and insight about going on this journey looking for the ultimate, and going through these different stages, these dark night of the soul type experiences, and dealing with the various sort of dispositions of ego that can be sort of roadblocks. All sorts of fables and beautiful prose. There's some good translations of it out there. So I think that's a helpful text for people coming to this material that might not be ready to bite off deep esoteric philosophy with a lot of Arabic terminology and sort of Quranic sort of reference that's implicit and things like that. In terms of a scholar, someone perhaps more contemporary and more on the kind of intellectual side of the tradition, I think I'd go with one of two authors. One is Sayyid Hussein Nasr, a big traditionalist and perennialist sort of philosopher and Islamic thinker. He's got a ton of great books, really unpacking this Ihsan side of the religion, whether it be sort of Sufi inflected or he's Shia, so he draws on that tradition a lot as well. But very cosmopolitan, interreligious, deep philosophical reflections, Neoplatonic kind of metaphysics behind it. Then someone totally different is Khaled Abu al-Fadl, who is sort of contemporary, sort of Islamic legal thinker. I think he lives in California or something, but he's deeply traditional. He's very classically trained, but he's doing a lot of this kind of forward thinking of the Islamic tradition. So he has a pretty kind of iconic or famous ruling that the hijab is not mandatory in certain circumstances in the modern world. And so he's drawing on genuinely traditional Islamic material to come out with those things. So he's got a good book called The Great Theft, which kind of deconstructs this sort of Salafi fundamentalist mentality and represents a genuinely kind of traditional Islamic perspective that is going to be more dynamic and less kind of literalist. So it's helpful with some of that historical material.
Great. I have, there's some ambiguity in the West around whether Allah is the Arabic God or the Arabic word for God, right? Because you can get translations of the Quran which translate all the other words and leave that one untranslated. Now, you could argue that that's a sign of respect for the sacred acoustics, and that it connects with what you were talking about, with sort of symbolic consonants of the letters that make up Islamic words. You could also argue that it's a sort of subtle xenophobic move to keep their God over there and not allow ourselves to realize that we're contemplating the same divinity together. So where do you come down on that? Translate or not translate Allah?
Yeah, I think it's definitely both sides of it that you just mentioned. Personally, I mean, it depends a lot on the audience. I typically translate. It's more my inclination. Though, of course, in Islamic circles themselves, it makes a lot of sense to keep that sort of original Arabic name. But there's a lot of confusion there. A lot of evangelical types, polemics that these people are worshiping some moon god. Not at all historically based. This is very clearly a expression of Abrahamic monotheism. Whether Christians and Jews like and accept that or not, the self-understanding is very, very clearly that we're dealing with the self-same God as was presented in the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels and so on. So,
okay. I don't know if you've ever read The Alphabet versus the Goddess, but it sort of details the almost instinctive attacks waged by the phallo-logocentric forces of the Hebraic book cult against people who were using imagery and statues in their religions. It was sort of a war of word against image, or the left brain violently imposing itself on the right brain, something like that. There's obviously a tradition in certain forms of Mohammedanism of not depicting the prophet, not depicting some of the highest values. Yeah, and is that something that places them into a special transcendental space out of the reach of ordinary signification and sensory depiction? Or is it a kind of innate reactivity against imagery and the world and the feminine and the right brain and things like that?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I don't think it falls so far on that latter side of things. There's pathologies that can develop with any of these strong positions. I think Islamic tradition, in its genuinely traditional forms, does a good job with iconoclasm for the most part, I think. And you have these beautiful sort of mosque architectures that just open up sacred geometry in a way that uses form to get you to the formless, ideally. And same thing with Islamic calligraphy, which again connects with that kind of occult science of the letters that the Sufis developed. But yeah, traditionally, despite this certainly iconoclastic orientation, you do have depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in sort of Persian miniature art. Oftentimes, his face will be veiled, and sort of that's kind of the expression of the sort of hiddenness or the occultation of this sort of highest spiritual instantiation in creation. But sometimes you don't have that, and you do have a depiction of the Prophet. Some of my favorites are the depiction of this night journey, the Mirage, where he ascends into heaven on this magical horse, Barak, and gets to meet the other prophets and negotiates with God to make sure that it's only 5 prayers and not like 10,000 that are required each day. Gets to fly over Jerusalem, all this interesting stuff. So there's beautiful evocative traditional art depicting this mystical journey. Divine feminine. I think the Shias are a bit stronger on this point than the Sunnis, with some kind of unique cosmology they have around the figure of Fatima, who's the daughter of the Prophet, married to his cousin Ali, I believe. And some really interesting stuff there. One important aspect here in terms of the language is sort of the intended orality of the scripture, rather than it being meant as a sort of collected written work. And I think that in general shies away from this kind of fallow-logocentric kind of orientation that Derrida and others found so problematic, because it keeps the sacred word in human, interpersonal, relational contexts, and it connects it with sort of the beauty of incantation, which naturally, I think, would shy away from the kind of rigidification of scripture that happens in literalist circles, where scripture is taken as this sort of set resource of clear statements that you can use to sort of order ethical living. So returning to scripture as this mysterious kind of unveiling that we can be sort of conduits for as human agents, I think is helpful. And then also just in the Quranic language itself, got all these names of God. There's certainly a mix of sort of masculine and feminine in terms of the grammatical gender. So whereas Christianity has a pretty clear notion in its traditional forms of sort of God the Father as one of these persons of the Trinity, so you got a pretty sort of masculine valence of this fundamental reality. And Catholics and Orthodox do a decent job in their sort of best forms of really venerating Mary, mother of Jesus, as sort of this mother of God, this deeply feminine cosmological principle. But I think that's more integrated into the sort of monotheistic, transcendent, immanent divinity within sort of Islamic sources itself. So the word for like the divine essence, for example, is in the feminine gender. So it's a pretty strong proclamation there.
From the point of view of Islamic wisdom, what does the divine gain by having humans, or maybe sapient beings generally, emerge and recognize and enter into loving contemplation of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is where a Sufi mystic like Ibn Arabi is particularly evocative, and then all his sort of interpreters and students that he spawned have made a lot out of some of these ideas. So yeah, the divinity is fulfilled in a sense by creation. So there's this famous hadith that is in this unique category called Hadith Qudsi, where ostensibly God is speaking directly through the Prophet Muhammad, even though this is not sort of a part of the Quranic revelation, where this is sort of the whole idea that it's God using the Prophet as a conduit to express this message. So an interesting source here, but basically the hadith goes along the lines with God speaking, saying, I was a hidden treasure. I longed to be known, so I created creation so that I may be known. And this is sort of one of the foundations of Sufi metaphysical ideas, that a divinity in sheer occultation, unrelated, is in a sense a divinity that lacks something. So a oneness that includes a multiplicity of sort of self-manifestation in limited forms is a more fulfilled divinity than that is this oneness that is an undifferentiated unity, non-relational sort of thing. So you have this Arabic word tajalli, which means sort of a theophany, and this is sort of the bedrock of the Sufi cosmological perspective, as far as I can tell, that all these aspects of creation, all existent things, have their existence through the participation in certain of God's attributes. So the mountain has this attribute of majesty, and that is sort of the mountain is existing through God's majesty, and it is also a sign, an ayah of this attribute of God that can be intuited by other creatures, basically. And so human beings are sort of unique in this way, that they're considered to have the capacity to embody the whole gamut of the divine attributes. So whereas a mountain is not really going to be compassionate in any way that is sort of easily understood, a human being can be both majestic and vast and compassionate and just and all these different things that are these sort of attributes of God, these particular differentiations of the unitive divine essence. And so certainly the Prophet Muhammad is the prototype of this sort of spiritual perfection. It's not quite an incarnational perspective, certainly because it's not considered as sort of this unique aspect of any one human being, but a potentiality that exists and may be realized across ages. Prophets in general certainly do this, sages and saints after the prophetic period can also ascend to this level of sort of the perfected human being, insan al-kamil. And so through that, that is one way that God is able to self-express in the world and bring mercy and justice and compassion to all beings through this spiritual cultivation of saints and sages in any time, but certainly through all things. All things are embodying God's divine names in unique ways. So you can see how this is a very Platonic emanationist type of perspective that the Sufis are giving sort of a Quranic backbone here with some of the particular material they're using. But it works very well. I think it's a very robust cosmology that has a lot of it offers a lot in terms of conceptualizing spiritual cultivation, thinking through things like theodicy, etc.
We talked a little bit earlier about the tendency of a lot of Islam to look to the past and maybe to want to ground themselves in a primordial wisdom. But from another angle, 600 AD is not that long ago, right? Islam tends to inhabit a part of the world, Egypt and Persia and Mesopotamia and India, that's been occupied 5, 10, 15,000 years by spiritually active civilizations. What's your sense of a deeper looking back that might exist within Islamic culture? What's their sense of their relationship to far older spiritual traditions in the places where they live?
Yeah, I think the sort of Quranic message here is actually very clear and very helpful in this regard. The sort of orthodoxy that has developed after the fact, less so. So basically, the central idea in the Quran, working off of previous Abrahamic revelations, is that God is in communication with humanity through sending prophets, messengers, with these revelations that are forms of guidance for humankind. There's certainly many prophets mentioned in the Quran, many of which are going to be familiar to Jewish and Christian audiences. But the scripture specifically mentions that, we've singled out a number of these figures, but actually there's a crazy amount, I think it's like 140 some thousand prophets that have been sent by God to all communities. Each community has been sort of given their prophet. So that opens up the doors to very sort of pluralistic kind of approach to other wisdom traditions that sort of pre-existed the Islamic revelation. And I think that's very helpful in being able to integrate these things and interface with them in healthy ways. There's other sorts of hadith material where you have this statement that something along the lines of wisdom is the property of the believers. So this very cosmopolitan sort of orientation towards that which is wise, good, spiritually nourishing, and if it exists in sort of other spaces, that is sort of one's right to be nourished by it. On the flip side, you have this idea that the Quran is this sort of final revelation, the most universal, the most sort of authoritative. So any material, any scripture or wisdom tradition that has this kind of prophetic or religious character to it is abrogated by the Quranic revelation, which this is more so what the sort of orthodoxy ended up running with, is that the Jews and Christians have these sort of corrupted, decadent scriptures, and the Quran is this correction and recapitulation of what these previous revelations meant to express, but have over the course of history sort of lost or become degraded in that expression. So that's a somewhat unfortunate turn of the development of the tradition. I think there's a lot of reason that Muslims could read the biblical text and sort of view this in a less suspicious, more positive light, that this is part of the story of God's communication with humanity. And while there may be things in here which sort of evidently do not accord with Islamic perspectives, such as sort of the incarnation of Christ and crucifixion and such, which are kind of explicitly denied, there's still significant material that is obviously consonant with the general idea and ideals of revelation in the Quran, and no reason that this may not also be taken as important material, in my estimation. And you do see Muslims that do that nowadays, that will look to the Bible and quote biblical verses as examples of wisdom traditions that have something to say that may give a slightly different angle than the Quranic perspective, even as they would obviously view the Quran as, if not explicitly stating some of these same things, at least sort of having the same sort of value orientation. And you can do that with Buddhism and Taoism, Confucian. It's just going to get a little hard to sort of interface some of those more kind of polytheistically oriented traditions.
Looking at all the traditions, seems like, given the world situation, that our wisdom teachings and our spirituality has to privilege ecology somehow going forward. Mm-hmm. And when we think about Islam, and maybe it's just our stereotypical image of what deserts are like, something like that, but it seems to be very theocentric and anthropocentric. And I don't see a lot of information about what a Sufi environmentalism or an Islamic spiritual ecology would look like. What is your sense of the relationship between Islam and ecology, and what does it need to be going forward? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're working off some good material here, even as it has been kind of underemphasized at certain points in the historical development. So coming from this kind of Sufi cosmological perspective, where all things are theophanies or manifestations of God, this gives a very spiritual tenor to the natural world in important ways that are conducive to ecological thinking. But generally, having this more naturalized spirituality, I think, is an easier perspective to hold within Islam than Christianity. If I put on my Christian glasses and I try to have, say, a beautiful experience of nature that is spiritually satisfying and in sort of conducive to sort of unveiling and insight, it feels a little strange that I'm sort of getting spiritual wisdom from something other than Christ. You know, Christ is this pinnacle, this the incarnation in a very unique sense. And I think Christianity has resources through thinking more holistically about the Holy Spirit as a person of the Trinity in creation, but often neglected. I think Islam is very clear about the sort of existence of God in the natural world. Even just in the Quranic text, it's constantly mentioning that there's signs from God in the natural world, and signs here is the word ayat, and it's the same word that is used for individual verses of the Quran. So it has a pretty clear connection here between scriptural revelation and say natural revelation, the book of nature and sort of the literal book of God. So to have a experience of spiritual unveiling in the natural world feels very, very natural in that regard. And I'd also say that just the sort of form of Islamic spiritual life is pretty deeply nature oriented. The time of day of the prayers is dictated by the solar movements. The months are on this lunar calendar, and you're fasting for one of them. You can do these ritual prayers, your 5 daily prayers, in any sort of clean place. So don't be doing it in the bathroom, but if you are in the forest or on a mountain, this is an open place for you to pray just as well as the mosque itself is, and orienting to a certain direction on earth in a communal sort of fashion. It does have this sort of earth-centered kind of tenor to it that
it's interlinked with the natural world, but does
definitely
translate into care for the natural world, and then does that
Mm-hmm.
care translate into a sort of social ethic around that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think traditionally it's been more the case than it has now, where a lot of countries in the Muslim world have become rich off of oil, and they're not really thinking through the religious permissibility of the environmental degradation that comes with that as an economic driver. But there's pretty clear, for example, legal rulings that in sort of times of war, it's like impermissible to engage in environmental degradation of one's adversaries. So you can't be destroying their agriculture, wanton cutting down forests and such. And likewise, the welfare of animals is strongly emphasized in the tradition, with some hadith material and legal perspectives. So it's definitely there. I think there's still some work to be done to bring that material into sort of deeper conversation with contemporary and environmental perspectives. But even, for example, the dietary stuff, the sort of halal eating, I think can have a very sort of ecological bent to it, that the way you slaughter your animals and practice that kind of agriculture, it's meant to be a sort of deeply ethical relationship. And that's part of what those restrictions sort of provide, as an ethical framework for slaughtering other living beings to create sustenance. And were those regulations stringently followed, you'd have a very different agricultural system than the industrial one that is largely uncaring towards the suffering of these beings that become our food.
I guess we're pretty much near the end of this thing. Is there anything else you find that's really exciting or leading edge about Islam today that I haven't asked you about?
Yeah, just to sum up, I think there's so much rich traditional material in the Islamic intellectual traditions that has something important to contribute in our cosmopolitan, pluralistic, metamodern moment. And I think also some of the issues in the Islamic world offer sort of important touchstones for thinking through some of these things more holistically, in a way that is more global and not too sort of Western Eurocentric kind of stuff, because there's some very different ways that some of these things interface when put into conversation with the Islamic tradition versus Christianity or sort of other Western strands. And also Islam itself is sort of deeply Western in many ways, and the West is itself deeply Islamic, and so there isn't this sort of hard binary between the two. There isn't some big other here. These are Siamese twins, perhaps, who often bicker, and can be some serious issues with that, as we well know. But yeah, looking forward to hopefully seeing some more healthy, holistic, integral Islamic thinking in our world, which we are certainly already seeing in many quarters, and hopefully that can contribute to some wisdom to these conversations. And likewise, hopefully some of the Western quote unquote material can be taken up by Muslims and synthesized in creative and healthful ways to offer something to the tradition itself.
Well, terrific. Thank you, Jared, because, there's a sense in which developmental transformational communities lean heavily towards either a kind of Buddhist approach or a kind of new cognitive science approach, right? It's often felt that there's not quite enough room for monotheistic religion in general, and in particular Islam, because it's has some weird cultural dissonance with a lot of people in the West. And I'm personally very aware of how shallow and unvisceral my sense of the richness of Islam is. So I appreciate this very much. And I wonder what would be an appropriate Islamic prayer to end a discussion with.
Yeah, interesting question. Gotta be Al-Fatiha, which is the kind of first chapter of the Quran and the most central sort of Islamic prayer out there. It's said during each of the sort of units of the daily prayers. And if you had to draw a comparison to Christianity, I would say this is the Lord's Prayer of Islam. And so I can certainly give it a go here for the listeners if they'd like it. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbi Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. Idina siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladina an'amta alayhim. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Ameen. There we are, Al-Fatiha, the opening. So may this conversation also be an opening for our listeners, an opening to deeper cross-cultural understandings and spiritual illuminations and curiosity for other forms of religion, spirituality, wisdom traditions in our beautiful world.
May it be an opening. Thanks so much, Jared.